Hi, everybody. Welcome to Workshop 60, Turning Wearables Data into Research Insights. My name is Jack. I'll be moderating the session, and we're joined today by Dr. Britton from Vanderbilt University, as well as Dr. Cook from New York University. So to get started, we'll do some very brief intros from the three of us, and then we'll do a quick poll. So as I mentioned, my name is Jack. I'm a senior health economist and outcomes researcher at Google. A lot of my research focuses on using wearable data to understand how health behaviors impact health outcomes. Dr. Cook?
Hi, I am Stephanie Cook. I'm an associate professor in the departments of global biostatistics and social behavioral sciences at the NYU School of Global Public Health. And a lot of my work looks at how stress and structural stressors kind of get under the skin and affect our bodies internally.
Hi, everyone. I'm Evan Britton. I'm a professor of medicine and cardiologist at Vanderbilt. I treat patients with heart failure in clinic, but I spend most of my time doing research, studying the epidemiology of various cardiovascular diseases, and in particular with a focus on learning from consumer wearable devices, trying to gain insights from behavior and physiology and how that intersects with cardiovascular disease.
Thanks to you both. And just a few housekeeping items to get started. If you were at earlier session today, this is all very familiar to you, but as a reminder, Science Day is a public event. If you would like to see closed captions, you can turn those on. And if you experience any technical issues or have a request for accommodations, please email all of us Science Day at pixispartners.com. And one other thing, before we launch into the content, if you have questions, please select the Q&A option on the top right of your screen to ask your question. And you can also put your question into the chat. And with that, we'll do a little bit of a warm-up. So given that we are talking about wearables research today, using the All of Us dataset, we wanted to know from the audience which of the following best describes your level of familiarity with the wearables data on the All of Us researcher workbench currently. So maybe you're not aware of or not familiar with the wearable data and you're looking to learn more. Maybe you're aware of the data but have not explored it yourself. Maybe you have some experience, or maybe you're very comfortable using the wearable data for health research. So I'll ask our session coordinators to launch the poll so you can respond. And then we'll give folks maybe 20 seconds to get those responses in. Okay, looks like people responded very quickly. So as you can probably see on the poll results, we've got 48% of our attendees who are aware of the wearables data but have not explored it. So fortunately for you all, we'll be talking much more about how to get started, how to start working with this data, and what kinds of insights you can glean from using this wearable data with all the other linked sources of data on all of us. And for the 27% who are already comfortable using the wearable data, hopefully you'll find some of this featured research inspiring and for you to continue doing more very exciting wearables research going forward. Okay, thank you for that. So to kick things off, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the value of wearables data for health research, and then highlighting some of the ways in which wearables data has already been used on the All of Us researcher platform. And so for some of you, this may be existing knowledge. For others of you, this might be helpful as a way of grounding the conversation today. So to start off with, commercial wearable devices such as Fitbits, they monitor health metrics over a long period of time. And so often this means we're getting years of continuous data from people participating in the research. And using validated algorithms and accelerometry and PPG signals, wearables these days can track your level of physical activity as well as intensity, physiological biomarkers, as well as measures of sleep duration and quality. And what's exciting about wearables for health research are some of the key benefits. One, relative to, say, self-reported metrics, this passive collection helps to mitigate the over and underestimates of individual self-reported behaviors. This also provides real-world observations in between healthcare touchpoints. So if you're doing health research, you may be familiar with working with EHR data or other ways of understanding an individual's interactions with the healthcare system. Having wearables data actually gives us a view into all the different health behaviors that you're engaging in between those visits. And just to mention, relative to research devices, these kind of commercial wearable devices provide much longer follow-up and at a lower cost. So again, a benefit for health researchers. And just to give you a preview of the wearables data on the All of Us Researcher Workbench, and many of you mentioned that you are aware of the wearables data. So currently over 59,000 All of Us participants are contributing data from their Fitbit devices. And these are then linked to other demographic, health surveys, and EHR data. Access is provided to researchers via the registered tier of data. And the types of data include activity, heart rate, sleep, and device information. And so you'll see highlighted here, this is at different levels of granularity, so ranging from daily summaries down to even minute level detail. And it's very heartening to see that the wearables data has gotten a lot of interest already from all of us researchers. So currently, over 1,000 workspace projects mention the use of wearables or Fitbit data in their research. Over 31 publications across a whole range of different focus areas, including cardiovascular disease, metabolic health, mental health, post-operative recovery, and maternal health have been published using this data. And across all these studies, we're finding that, one, higher physical activity and better sleep quality are associated with lower chronic disease risk. And two, adding wearable metrics to clinical models meaningfully improve prediction of hospitalizations, readmissions, and incidence of mental health conditions. And so to tell us more about how researchers have been translating wearable signals into health research insights, I'd like to invite Dr. Cook to tell us a bit more about her research.
Hello. So Jack just walked you through what the wearable data is and what is available on the workbench. I want to show you what you can do with it when you link it to other data sources and why that linkage matters for equity research specifically. So my work really asks whether sedentary time disparities by race are widening over time, whether they predict cardiovascular health downstream, and whether they carry a sleep pathway. So to answer those three questions, I need all three data streams. I need the Fitbit data to measure behavior continuously over months, not just a 7-day window, and to do so objectively and passively. I need the electronic health records to measure an actual clinical outcome 1 year later, because behavior without a health consequence is not enough. And I need the survey data linked to the American Community Survey estimates as the neighborhood level to test whether these kind of structural conditions like poverty and resource access explain what I'm seeing in the behavioral data. Each stream is doing distinct scientific work, which is really important. The Fitbit alone tells us what people are doing, but the EHR tells us what it costs them clinically. And then the survey and neighborhood data tell me kind of why the disparities exist in the first place. And so on the next slide, I'll show you a little bit about kind of what this means in real time. So there's two panels here kind of showing what these linkages produce. On the left, we use 22 months of continuous Fitbit data. Continuous Fitbit data linked to electronic health records. We found that sitting more predicts worse heart health a full year later. And that light movement, things like walking around the house or pacing during a phone call, predicts better heart health, which is really interesting and important. But the more striking finding is that the ratio gap in sitting time is not stable. It's actually widening over time. So Asian participants are accumulating 9.1 extra minutes of sedentary time per month compared to white female participants or Hispanic participants, for example. So over 22 months, that adds up. So we test whether, the next question is, okay, so what are the things that can change this dynamic? So we tested whether COVID-19 explained these patterns, and it does not. So the disparities reflect structural conditions that kind of are operating continuously across the entire study period. So, on the right, the bar chart shows the sleep story. So sitting more in 1 month predicts shorter sleep the following month. And we see that there's also like disparities in race and sex in this finding as well. So white female participants lose about 5 minutes of sleep for every 100 extra minutes of sitting. But that relationship is actually weaker when we're looking at Asian, Black, and Hispanic participants. So when your work schedule, your neighborhood, and your caregiving demands are controlling both how much you move and when you sleep, the connection between those two things kind of breaks down. So it's not a protective effect. It's kind of a single signal of constraint instead. So taken together, these findings show that linking Fitbit data to health records and neighborhood context does something no single data stream could do alone. It reveals not just that disparities exist, but that they are growing, that they have real clinical consequences, and that the structural conditions, and it helps us identify the structural conditions that are driving them. So thank you for letting me give you that little overview, and now I'm going to pass it over to Evan.
You sort of a sample of the kinds of questions that we've asked and what we've learned from the integration of wearable devices with the electronic health record. And I first want to just draw your attention to the sheer volume of this information. So looking at the top, the numbers on the top lines there. So about 44.5 million person days of Fitbit monitoring, 322 billion accumulated steps, and almost 28 million sleeping events, not all of which are at night. And so with this, we began to ask some rather simple epidemiologic questions. For example, what are the associations between daily step counts and cardiovascular disease, including various chronic diseases shown here? And so I'll orient you that the hazard ratio is on the y-axis. Average daily step counts in thousands are on the x-axis. And what you see is that once you reach about 8,000 steps per day, you begin to accrue some benefit. Some of those relationships are quite linear. Some of them plateau off at around 8,000 or 9,000 steps per day. But I think this is an important message for patients because we've got this notion in our head that 10,000 steps per day is the optimal number for achieving general health. And it turns out that really patients can accrue some benefit well below 10,000 steps per day. Another benefit of having almost 60,000 individuals with Fitbit data is you can identify and study some really interesting subgroups. So here we've identified women who had a Fitbit on before they got pregnant, for the duration of pregnancy, and then for 2 years following delivery. And we compared them to women who also wore Fitbit during the same time period, but did not get pregnant. That's the blue line. And what you see, orienting you to the far left with step counts, is that as pregnancy progresses, each of those vertical dashed lines is a trimester threshold. So as pregnancy progresses, there is a decline in step counts, lowest around the time of delivery, no surprise there. And it takes about a year for average daily step counts to rebound to pre-pregnancy levels in this group. To the right of that, looking at light activity, there's a little bit of a decline during pregnancy, but really a huge increase in the first couple of years after delivery. No surprise to any parent in the audience there. To the right of that, looking at minutes of sleep, we found that the duration of sleep really begins to decline during the third trimester, and like step counts, really doesn't recover to pre-pregnancy levels until about a year after delivery. I think the most intriguing and maybe important observation is that women who develop postpartum depression had an initial rebound in step counts, but really that began to trail off after about 6 months. And we're testing whether access to this kind of real-time behavioral information might be able to serve as sort of an early warning or a trigger to identify women who might benefit from depression screening or counseling for this common but underdiagnosed condition. And then the final example brings in yet another data stream. So here we're also taking advantage of the nearly 500,000 whole genome sequences in all of us. So linking behavior with genetics, and specifically in this study asking the question, how much physical activity is needed to account for an individual's genetic risk for obesity. So I'll orient you here. The y-axis is the hazard ratio for obesity. The x-axis is average daily step counts in thousands. And we stratified individuals based on their genetic risk for BMI. And so we've used a polygenic risk score. Drawing your attention to the middle line here, which is the 50th percentile of genetic risk. So this is the population median. What you see is that those individuals need to walk on average 8,700 steps per day to reduce the risk of obesity. Whereas if you have a higher genetic risk, looking at the yellow line, which is the 75th percentile of polygenic risk, those individuals would need to increase their step count by this estimate by about 2,300 steps per day. And that's about a 20-minute walk at an average stride length. And so this, I think, is a somewhat empowering message. It says genetics are not destiny, and that with some purposeful increases in movement, you can potentially mitigate a higher genetic risk for obesity through increased activity. So I'll end there. Just wanted to give you sort of a flavor of the kind of work that you can, questions you can ask with these kinds of integrated data streams.
Thank you, Dr. Britton. And we are going to invite the audience to ask some questions in a moment. But to just start off, as you are thinking about what questions to ask our speakers, I thought I might take the prerogative and ask the first question. And so, Dr. Cook, can you hear me okay? Perfect. So we heard Dr. Cook talk a little bit about her research that's focused on population health and health disparities. I'm curious, Dr. Cook, could you tell us a little bit more about how the use of wearable data in particular has helped you advance your research in this area?
Of course, that's a great question. I think that, the wearable data changed what questions I'm able to ask. So before continuous Fitbit monitoring, I was limited to kind of these self-reported physical activities or short accelerometer windows of 7 days or less. A lot of my work is in EMA. Neither of those gives you kind of this longitudinal resolution to detect whether disparity is widening over years or months. And so you can better see where those gaps exist, and then you can better explain them. And so all of us wearable data gave me, these 22 months of continuous behavioral data. But not only that, I was able to use the different data sources and link them to really answer critical questions that we just don't have the answers to right now. And so this is what allowed me to show that the racial gap in sedentary time, it's not static, but it's actually widening, and show how, these different, cardiovascular health outcomes are changing 1 year later, and it gives it temporal ordering. So it's a little bit closer to causation. And so having this wearable data is critically important, not only for precision medicine, but for epidemiological research. So we know where and how to intervene, and we have a population level picture of what's really going on in the world of health equity.
Fabulous. Thank you, Dr. Cook. And then a question for Dr. Britton to get us started. I understand you still see patients in the clinic. So I'm curious, as you're looking at the different insights that are derived from wearable data over the course of your research, in what ways have you seen this potentially impacting clinical practice?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first thing I'll comment on is just the acknowledging the fact that these data are becoming part of clinical care. The All of Us data set is so unique because it's linked consumer wearables with the electronic health record for the first time, which seems like an intuitive thing to do, but really hasn't been done at scale. And most institutions have not found ways as yet to integrate that into the electronic health record that's provider facing. But most of my patients show up with an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or another device, and they're very interested in my thoughts about what the behavioral and physiologic data that they've recorded. So we spend a lot of time looking at their trends. And I think that allows me to generate some personalized, I think, recommendations based on an individual's behavior. I'll say the other thing, I didn't mention some of the work that we've done, but the one thing I spent a lot of time talking about in clinic that I didn't expect to when I was training is sleep hygiene. Most of the sleep history we've gotten before these kinds of objective data were available is sort of non-specific. I can't go to sleep or I wake up early, that sort of thing. But with these devices measuring granular sleep metrics, we really can understand disruptions in sleep architecture and what what from a clinical perspective is associated with disease risk. And what we've learned from our studies is it turns out the most important metric for sleep is not how much REM sleep or deep sleep or even the duration of sleep. It's how regular your sleep onset and offset are. So if you go to bed at the same time and you wake up at the same time, that's one of the best things you can do in terms of sleep hygiene. And that's something that patients can, by and large, control. And so we spend a lot of time talking about that aspect of sleep hygiene.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think this just begins to highlight the many ways in which the All of Us data set is helping to drive discovery to impact. And so I want to invite the audience to add their questions for our panelists. So again, just a reminder, you're welcome to add questions in the Q&A box, or you can even raise your hand to ask a live question if you would like. To raise your hand, just click the small hand icon located at the bottom of the chat box, and then I will call your name. You can unmute yourself to ask your question. So we already have a few questions come through the chat. So I'll read it, and Dr. Cook and Dr. Britton, feel free to jump in and answer. So for the panel, is there a group or community either inside of the All of Us workbench or outside, either a social media chat group that is collaborating on use and algorithm developed to characterize the Fitbit data that you two are aware of?
So I think there's lots of groups. I guess you're asking, are there kind of public groups that you can join? And I think that there are a lot of communities of people working in the Fitbit data, and with the open workspaces, that's a really great place to find people to work with in terms of the wearable data. And then I just know of a lot of people because of my work with All of Us. But I think that one thing that, we probably need more of is kind of a wider community of people that are kind of in the weeds working on some of the technical parts. But, that's just, based on my work with the data. The other panelists might have more information.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm really not familiar with any public groups or others that are sort of team-oriented to working on this topic.
Yeah, that said, I think this sounds like an area where the All of Us team could think about developing some resources around. Okay, second question. My Fitbit does not accurately record my sleep. I sleep more than it records. How does the Fitbit determine sleep? And I think additional context around reliability of the various parameters and how does that affect research? So I'll start by mentioning that there are quite a number of third-party validation studies that have been published looking at the Fitbit sleep metrics relative to gold standard ways of measuring sleep. And so as a baseline, I would say the sleep metrics are fairly well validated for health research, and that obviously carries over into the work that both Dr. Cook and Dr. Britton have done. I am curious, though, from the both of you, kind of what considerations are there when you're using the sleep data that folks on the call might want to be aware of as you're thinking about this?
I can go. So before the WEAR study came out, I was using the BYO D data, and that was very difficult. Because when you bring your own Fitbit device, that means that there's many different devices. And then like in the middle, somewhere in the middle, the algorithm was changed. It was very interesting. But that data has it's much longer in scope than the WEAR study, which makes it a rich data source. And so what we did after several rounds of reviews and working with, sleep experts is we came up with a metric that worked for a valid way to measure sleep. And so, our first paper was a really crude measure of like less than 7 hours, but it had to be 7 hours of sleep between like 8 p.m. and like 6 a.m. the next day. And then we did a lot of sensitivity analysis to make sure that that time frame worked with the particular sample. But I will say that we went from, 59,000 people to a sample of closer to 10,000 people, just because we had to, have these kind of rigorous cutoffs to properly measure hours of sleep per night. So there are issues with the data, but there's issues with all data everywhere. And so it's really just making sure your work is really rigorous and there's a lot of sensitivity analyses to make sure that we all have more confidence in the work.
That's I agree completely with that. I'll add 2 points. One is that when we work with these data, we do some cleaning or curating based on sort of what we think are reasonable thresholds for, does someone actually wear the device regularly enough that we think we understand their habitual sleep behaviors. We also make some exclusions around the number of hours and that heart rates can be tracked so that we know that they're actually wearing the device, et cetera. The other sort of, I think, fundamental point I'll make is Jack talked about third-party sort of comparisons and validations of Fitbits, and they actually do perform quite well. But even if Fitbits or Apple Watch or whatever device don't perfectly align with, let's say, polysomnography, what is valuable is a longitudinal trend. So if someone's wearing the same device over a long period of time, it's perfectly valid to understand their trends over time, even if the individual measurements on a given day may not align perfectly with the ground truth. And so that's one of the sort of framings that we've taken from this.
Yeah, thank you both. And then I'll just flag for our participants that we'll talk about some helpful resources to get started a little later on in the webinar. Next question. For the panel, linking health data to Fitbit data over 22 months, is this linking temporal in nature? How do you deal with the longitudinal nature of these separate data sets? And I'll start off by saying I think the All of Us research program has done a great job in really harmonizing the data, very complex data types over time. So I would love to hear maybe from Dr. Cook, as you're thinking about working with the data that's over long periods of time, what considerations do you have to take when you're working with such large and complex information?
Wow. That's lovely. Like, I love data. So let me just start there. And so we spend a lot of time together. And I think that, as also a professor of biostats, I think that the number one thing I do is like, I make sure that I have a really clean data set. And so I spend months with my team working through making sure that that the data we have matches, the structure of the data matches the questions we want to answer. So for example, with temporal ordering, that's pretty difficult when you're working sometimes with the EHR. You have to make decisions about, first the occurrence of, a diagnosis, an ICD code, or, or is it, a disease that once you have it, you always have it, or, because people go to different providers. So it's about also sitting down, reading the literature and making decisions about, the points in the other data sources that you're going to rely on. So the particular analysis I talked about with 1 year later, the reason is because we were able to, I don't remember the exact finding, have data 1 year later and make sure and clean the data in a way where we had the IV a year before. But in all instances, that's not possible. So for example, in the last round of review, reviewer was like, you really need to have like time varying BMI. And I was like, well, that's impossible, right? Because like the Fitbit data, if you use BYOD and you're looking from 2017 to like 2024, trying to get like accurate BMI data to correlate with the data point for the wearable is like almost impossible. And so thinking through, okay, so how do we do sensitivity analysis with the basic BMI or with, picking some other kind of metrics for how to pull a BMI out of EHR to have more confidence in the results. So I think that was a long-winded way of saying that, we are very careful and we work very, very hard to make sure that our data structure matches our question before we get into like the really exciting longitudinal, complicated analyses. And then we also consult with clinicians, just to make sure we're as rigorous as possible. I hope that answered your question.
Thanks, Dr. Cook. And in thinking about sort of complex data sets and the other ways or the other data that could be correlated with wearables data, we have a question. Someone would like to hear more about integrating genetics data with wearable data. So Dr. Britton, are there quantitative traits that could lead to mechanistic insights or genetic insights into the features or phenotypes that we see in wearable data based on research?
Yeah, so this is, it's a really powerful opportunity to combine genetics, which we generally can't modify, with behaviors, which in many cases we can modify, and try to understand the interactions between those two. What you see on the slide right now is sort of our early example of trying to use genetic background, in this case for obesity, to derive some personalized estimates for, in this case, step counts. And you could consider, applying that across different conditions in the cardiovascular and metabolic space. I'm not a geneticist, so I don't want to sort of overstep my area of expertise. But another area where this is being applied that I've seen some early data is to sleep, and thinking about known genetic modifiers of chronotype, for example, and how that might interact with sleep behaviors that is captured by the Fitbit. So I think just a really powerful opportunity to learn more about the complex interactions between behavior and genetics.
Thank you, Dr. Britton. And I think this next question, we would love to get your input on as well. Someone asked, is there any analysis of Fitbit data with regard to the benefit of target heart rate for age in addition to steps per day? I think as a cardiologist, you are best positioned to provide some input on this. Yeah,
no, we've done some work around the association between resting heart rate and cardiovascular risk and various other conditions. We haven't focused as much on a specific target heart rate and recognizing that varies by age and fitness level. Very important. So this seems like it's an open area that someone else should tackle.
Yeah, and just to say, the richness of the wearable data on the platform, I think we're still just at the beginning of exploring. So this is an open call to all the researchers on the call on this webinar to continue exploring. Okay, next question, back to Dr. Cook. Have you looked into how environment and socioeconomic factors affect activity? This attendee is curious whether weather and climate change differentially impacts activity based on socioeconomic status.
That's a great question. So, most of my work uses these multi-level longitudinal models to kind of understand the ways in which, structure and changes in uh, structural conditions impact cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular health. But I will say I've not looked into the climate stuff. I'm not sure how much climate data the All of Us project has. I think they have some. So that's a really interesting uh, question. But I don't have any more any more like specific input on the climate. But it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, and again, not to speak on behalf of the All of Us program, but certainly understanding where researchers want to push the complexity and the sophistication of the analysis is likely helpful indicators for how this data set can grow over time. Okay, a couple of more questions. Dr. Britton, is there a reason why there aren't many genetics association studies using the Fitbit data linked together?
There should be more. That's a great question. I can speculate here, but maybe it requires multiple different kinds of skill sets on a team, ranging from genetics and bioinformatics and being able to handle this high dimensional data. So I don't know. That's a great question. I suspect there are many in progress, and maybe we'll be seeing more of those coming out soon.
Yeah. And before we go to the next question, I just want to encourage folks to add in their questions. We have about 4 more minutes in the Q&A portion. Again, feel free to raise your hand and come off mute if you would like to ask a question live. So this next question is for both of you. I think this attendee is highlighting that when integrating EHR snapshots with continuous wearable streams, the choice of an anchor point is critical. Could you give an example of how you've defined an analysis window? How do you think about handling patients or participants whose data don't perfectly overlap with their clinical encounters? Specifically, is it thinking about a clinical event like an ICD code? Did you use a data-driven window based on wearable availability? I think I'm getting the sense that this is a researcher who's thought very deeply about working with this data. So I'm wondering, Dr. Britton, maybe giving an example of how you approach this in one of recent studies could be helpful.
Yeah, this is a great question, and this is a challenge with EHR research in general, whether you're using wearables data or not. But layering on those continuous data with clinical care, which is sporadic and episodic, is particularly challenging. So a lot of this is just sort of, making thresholds and windows that we think are reasonable from a clinical perspective. I'll give you one example, which is a challenge with all observational retrospective studies, which is the idea of reverse causation. So, for example, someone may walk less because they have depression, or they may have a mood disorder because they're more sedentary, for example. One of the ways that we've dealt with that is we've started a window, for example, at the time that Fitbit device was, the monitoring started. So the first day they got the Fitbit device. And we have sort of excluded any new diagnoses within the first 6 months of monitoring, under the assumption that that condition probably already existed. It just hadn't been identified clinically yet. And so that helps us mitigate that specific kind of risk. But certainly can't be perfect in a retrospective study. Another example is, we've used these data to generate ASCVD risk scores, so the PREVENT score, for example, and that includes some laboratory values and blood pressure and some other things. And so we've decided in this instance to carry forward laboratory values from the prior calendar year, because I think clinically I would probably do the same for my patients. And so those are admittedly relatively arbitrary, but I think semi-informed kinds of windows that we've imposed for our kinds of studies. So it's a great question. It's a real challenge in EHR research in general. So that's just a couple of examples of specific things that we've applied.
Thanks, Dr. Britton. And I think we'll probably end on a more forward-looking question before we talk about some of the resources for getting started. Do you have any thoughts or predictions on where the science of wearables is headed, in both in all of us and perhaps outside? What improvements would you like to see? Dr. Cook?
Oh, sorry. um, I'm a part of the Wearable group for the American Statistical Society. So it's a group of like us that meet and we go to Banff, every couple years and we talk about this. And wearable data is just so important for our science because it's a passive and objective way to understand true clinical outcomes. Cardiovascular health is so important and is one of the most critical indicators of health and well-being over the life course. And I study emerging adulthood, so we can understand cardiovascular health in adolescence, right? And so developing the technology to actually make sense of this data is critically important, and it can just lead us into a whole new realm of how to attack or change precision medicine, but also where to intervene and where to kind of situate prevention work in public health. There's still some things we need to work on. So Fitbit, kind of estimates sleep using these kind of accelerometers. So basically it detects movement. When movement drops below a certain time, then it just figures your sleep, and that, I don't know, is that the best determination? Probably something we should work on. And, using the PPG, which kind of uses this green light sensor on the back of the device to measure changes in blood volume at the wrist, there's a lot of work that says there's variability in patterns and sleep stages. So, there are a lot of people working on that technology. And, what's really important for, researchers like me is to make sure that we are able to get this technology out in a more equitable way. So the WEAR study is really great because it basically oversamples for racial minorities to increase that in the sample, because in the all of us regular data, there's just not a lot of, there's not a significant proportion of diversity. So, there's limitations, but the path forward is limitless, especially if we keep having people come together, create new algorithms, and create new ways to make sense out of so much data, to affect future health outcomes and future clinical outcomes.
Dr. Britton, what do you think?
So I'll briefly just provide a clinical take on the future of wearables, and that is that I think eventually wearable data will become clinical data integrated into the EHR, and along with that will come a lot of challenges with how data are presented to providers, right? There's a sea of information, all of that's not relevant, so separating signal from noise will be very important. But I think once these data are integrated with the electronic health record, they offer an opportunity for lots of early detection model development. These can be used to define, call it a digital prodrome, where steps or sleep or heart rate deviate from a baseline for an individual in a clinically meaningful way, and that might prompt some medical contact, and with the goal to get that patient back up to their functional baseline. And then, of course, integrated also with genetic data will allow us to personalize recommendations. Just thinking a single example, the activity recommendations, which I strongly support, are one size fits all. But of course, risk of various conditions is not uniform across the population. So being able to refine that using an individual's behavior and physiology is going to be an important part of future wearables.
Fabulous. I think what I'm hearing you both say is the future of wearables is bright. And I imagine after all this talk about research, there's probably some attendees who are itching to get their hands on the data again to get started. Maybe let's spend the last portion of this webinar for both of you to give folks some helpful resources in thinking about getting started. And so, Dr. Britton?
Yeah, so I just wanted to highlight 3 resources. This is code that was used from several of the projects that our team did, and we have made that code available on the researcher workbench. If it's helpful to help you build cohorts and see how we've curated various data sets across activity and sleep, and the integration of polygenic risk scores with activity. So those links to those workspaces are available, and if my team can be helpful, please feel free to get in touch.
Dr. Cook.
And I just wanted to highlight that, I run the NYU All of Us Bridge program, and we have an intensive summer workshop. So if you're interested in learning more about wearables, how to use the data, so on and so forth, please consider applying. The deadline is April 24th. And also, addressing this need for people to just have a little bit more support in terms of analysis on the All of Us workbench. We also run a free biostatistical consultancy where you can get up to 15 hours at no cost. So please also consider using that and then meeting me, and we can talk a little bit more about wearables if you're interested in it. Thank you so much.
And thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you to Dr. Cook and Dr. Britton for your insights. And please, for the attendees, we're at the end of the session. Please complete one question survey after the session ends. And up next, we'll have concurrent sessions, one scientific session on understanding heart health, diabetes, and other long-term conditions, and another on how researchers are using data and technology to drive better health, likely a continuation of this conversation. Thank you for helping make health discoveries possible. The All of Us program would not be possible without our participants and our researchers. Thank you very much for your time.